Okay, this is my third lecture, Unit 4 of Music 296. We're talking about extended techniques, and we want to put this in context. Again, fourth unit of Music Theory 4 is about post-World War II music. Of course, this is just a ludicrously vast field, so we're just touching on things. This is a little bit of a survey course, you could call it. And also a little bit of a grab bag. And there's probably less actual theory in this portion of the class than any other portion. But it's also very interesting, and a lot of ideas, a lot of possibilities are opened up. And of course, a lot of the music we look at in this part of the semester, we could contextualize what we're looking at as being, in various ways. There's a geographical one. After World War II, the centers of composition, again, this is according to the canon. We don't have time to, talk about the canon and how that has changed and how it should change and should have changed, etc. But if we want to get the basics of how this discipline has been formed at this time, hopefully it will become more complex and more accurate and more interesting. But the way we form it now, there was a group of composers in Europe in the immediate aftermath of World War II clustered around a summer course in music in Darmstadt, Germany, who studied with Olivier Messiaen, who we've looked at before. And this included Stockhausen, Boulez, Luigi Nono, Berio, Xenakis, and some others. Then there was a group of composers in New York City that we've talked about also, called the New York School, named after the New York School of Painters. This was John Cage and some of his associates and students, basically John Cage, Earl Brown, Morton Feldman, and Christian Wolff. But there's lots of other activity. In this particular study of, and of course, the second half of the 20th century and the 21st century is really where centers of classical music composition, again, that's in the canon, and of course that's going to change with time, move out internationally. So we really start to get an international style, similar to the international style in architecture, certainly. Anyway, so if we're talking about extended techniques, however, we really start to see the influence of certainly jazz, but also, other traditional musics. Well, jazz isn't really a traditional music. It's a classical music. But we start to have influences from free improvisation, which is its own genre, and we don't necessarily have time to talk about that. But, we basically... a really straightforward way of looking at this, that's, the more straightforward, the less accurate it is probably, but we start to get, jazz, free jazz, and then experimental music, and I talked about John Cage and some others, experimental composers in New York, also on the West Coast, Henry Cowell, that we'll talk about. And these kind of come together to free improvisation. There's lots we could talk about in that regard. But free improvisation is where we see, this is a genre, a group of people that, it's very diverse, but people that are practitioners of this kind of music often perform without any kind of score or predetermined format or structure. Sometimes they do perform with structures, but not traditional compositions. But this is an area of activity where we find a lot of use of extended techniques in whatever instruments or voice or sound-making objects are being used. So we'll talk about that a little bit. Now, the other thing is we have to define what extended techniques are. And of course, it's a problematic term because, well, for instance, we'll start out with bowed string instruments, orchestral string instruments. Any of the extended techniques, not any of them, but many of them that we would look at. For instance, I don't know if you can call pizzicato an extended technique, but pizzicato, snap pizzicato or Bartók pizzicato, where you pull the string up and it snaps against the fingerboard. Pizzicato with the fingernail. Col legno, striking the string with the stick of the bow, or even bowing with the stick of the bow. All of those techniques go back probably, at least in these European versions of fiddles, go back to the at least the 17th century, the 1600s, all of them. So, extended techniques maybe. Another way to look at, extended techniques, a lot of them are ones that already existed. Certainly, when children first approach instruments, they immediately start experimenting with an instrument to see what it can do, aside from what it's supposed to do. And the process of learning an instrument or a voice almost seems like eliminating the inadmissible sounds or techniques for that instrument and learning a very narrow band of permissible activity. Some of this is to preserve the integrity of the instrument. Some of it is because there's an aesthetic preference endemic to the instrumental technique that's being promoted. And so the phenomenon of using extended techniques by composers and improvisers in the 20th century, 21st century, to a certain extent, is the allowing or re-allowing of techniques that already probably all of these composers and players had tried when they were kids, and then once they've been trained, they're like, well, hey, wait a minute, maybe we should allow ourselves to do this activity. So that's kind of an interesting thought. I remember when I was a kid, one of my sister's friends' dads was a linguist. I can't remember if he was a linguist or a child development specialist. I think he was a linguist, and he specialized in language acquisition in infants and toddlers. And I remember him saying that babies gradually or pretty quickly learn all of the possible phonemes that the mouth can make. And then language acquisition is a matter of filtering out the unnecessary ones, rather than, okay, here are the sounds you need to learn. Here, learn a new sound. That was very interesting to me. And again, this is somewhat how we teach not just performance, but also orchestration and composition. We say, among the set of things that you can already do, here are the things we're going to allow you to do. I'm just going to get some water here. Okay, now let's talk about each instrument family separately. And I've provided lots of great examples. Again, the internet, wow, it's opened up a whole new world. When I think of what I had to do to be able to bring examples to class, it was pretty tricky. You had to know people. You had to, find recordings and scores in wacky places. And that was kind of a specialty of mine, and now I don't have that cred anymore. Well, because it's so available now. Okay, let's talk about, again, bowed string instruments. I talked about those different techniques that go back to really the earliest days of these instruments. Now, in the 20th century, I mentioned the Bartók pizzicato. Bartók was the one that certainly snap pizzicato had been used in what we would call traditional music or folk music, and nail pizzicato also. But he was the first, to my mind, to write this direct request this type of pizzicato. But pretty soon, again, in the second half of the 20th century, we have composers starting to use almost every way of making a sound by bowing or plucking or tapping the instrument. And I've included a few examples for you. If we want to look at, for instance, a really good example of tapping the box of an instrument in the violin family, the Xenakis pithepracta, and I will include an example of this. And this is a piece that among other things, and we'll talk about this more when we get into the subject of sound mass, but using the sound of tapping the instrument as a percussion instrument and creating clouds of many, many instruments doing this. Very interesting effect, somewhat like hearing rain on a metal roof building. Then we've got Penderecki, famous Polish composer, still alive, wrote a very influential, famous piece called Threnody to the Victims of Hiroshima. We don't have time to talk about that. Very interesting piece, interesting genesis. But what we want to do, I mean, what happens in that piece is that Penderecki has a really interesting score that's kind of like a tablature for a conductor, and essentially he has lots of tapping, bowing on the wrong side of the bridge, and a few other techniques that you can look at. And I've included a kind of animated score that's really interesting. So you can look at that. And then probably if you want the most exhaustive sort of catalog of possible bowed or plucked or struck effects that you can use a bow or hands on a bowed string instrument. This is Lachenmann's Grand Torso for string quartet from the early 1970s. Lachenmann, very interesting composer, sort of hyper modernist and very interested in making music with noises, I would say, is one way to look at it, and also with gestures, the sort of human gestures, and the effects of those on an instrument, sort of the embodying of a human gesture, digital human gesture in sound, in an interesting way. We could talk a lot about that, but of course you can't talk to me, so it's hard for me to do what I normally do. But this is, you can look, I've given you a video where you can see the players playing, and another one with the score. The one with the players playing, you'll be able to see what they're doing. You know, bowing the tail piece, bowing the pegs, plucking the edge of the bridge, doing this really scary crunching sound, rotating the hair of the bow on the back of the instrument. It sounds like you're destroying the instrument, but it's really not. It doesn't damage anything, really. The fiddles are such a beautifully sensitive, sonically sensitive box that it doesn't take much to get sounds out of them. Now, you may find these sounds to be, unpleasant, especially if you're an educated musician or someone who plays one of these instruments. It seems like an affront. So you have to kind of get over that in order to appreciate this music and enjoy it. And kind of just let it happen. Okay? So in terms of strings, that's what I would say. I've also included a link to a CD that I did. I'm also a participant in the genre of free improvisation, and I do it both on viola and piano. I've specialized a little bit at doing what we would call prepared viola, and this is even an unusual technique in the field of extended techniques. We'll talk about prepared piano, which is a pretty well-known, pretty common thing to do. But preparing a viola or preparing a violin or a cello or bass is a little bit more difficult because we only have 4 strings and there's so much space between the strings. But, you know, I've used different things, some of which ideas I've borrowed from others and some of which I've come up with myself. But in other words, altering the strings by putting, for instance, alligator clips on the strings that mute the strings themselves or that turn the string into 2 or 3 or more resonating bodies. And actually, before I go on, I should mention, if we're talking about musical instrument theory, which we are, we want to try to, I put everything in 3s. Seems to work pretty well. But an instrument, I think most instrumental theorists would say an instrument has 3 parts. The actuator, this is the thing that brings an object into vibration. So for instance, the bow or the finger in the case of these string instruments. Then the vibrating medium. So that would be the string, the thing that vibrates and makes the initial sound, pitched or unpitched as the case may be, and the resonator. And that's the fiddle in the case of a string instrument. So the actual box, the actual instrument. So, and these are interesting to think about in terms of extended techniques, what's happening. So, and when we're doing extended techniques, are we altering the actuator, the vibrating medium, or the resonator? We can alter any of these things. Maybe this is the most common thing to change. I don't know. But also in my own work, using alternative bows, something I've sort of specialized in, using plastic sheets that are used for report covers. That's something I've done a lot of. And using organic objects. You can find some of that on my YouTube channel, using, weeds, dried weeds especially, is something I've done a fair amount of. And lots of other things. So you could look at my CD that's entitled simply Viola, which is all viola improvisations, solo improvisations, mostly using preparations or alternative bows, alternative plucking objects, plectrums, plectra, I guess you'd call them, and alternative tunings, left-hand pizzicato, hammer-ons, which guitarists will know what those are, lots of other things. And bowing with the stick, bowing with the hair and the stick at the same time, etc. Oh, and then finally, I've included again, 2 videos of George Crumb's Black Angels, very well-known, influential string quartet. Crumb will talk about, again, regarding piano, real pioneer in extended piano techniques. But this is an interesting piece, and again, I've provided a video that has the score, scrolling score, and one that has a video of the players, a live performance. This one has a ton of interesting techniques, including pedal tones, which we don't have time to go into, but they're different from brass pedal tones, which we're probably more familiar with. But this is where, and you can look this up and find out more about it, but when players will bow, have so much weight on the bow, and if you work at it long enough, you can actually get an octave below the normal note. I don't understand the physics of that. It's not a pretty sound, but it's an interesting sound. And then also bowing on the wrong side of the fingers. So instead of bowing between the fingers that are stopping the string and the bridge, you go between the on the other side. And this is very difficult, of course, for intonation and such. But the intention there is to get a sound that bypasses the resonance of the actual body of the fiddle. And he wanted to get this effect of a Renaissance era viol. So anyway, check that out. Now I will just warn you, it's a pretty, it's kind of like a horror piece, I guess, in times. It's a piece that evokes some dark themes. It's an anti-war piece. There's lots more we could talk about. You can read about it. But Black Angels, very interesting extended techniques. Let's move on to the subject of brass, which I probably, I've provided a few examples. And some of you might have more knowledge of this than I do, although I played a little bit of trumpet and euphonium and tuba in high school. But some of the extended techniques of brass, of course, these are ones that are not unique to Euro-American classical music and exist in other cultures, probably for thousands of years. If we're talking about brass and woodwind, the question of circular breathing comes into play. Again, circular breathing is prehistoric, and some of the oldest instruments that we know of could not be performed without circular breathing. And so, but, it wasn't used in classical music until, again, probably after the post-war period. And then we have, once we get into woodwinds and brass, we're talking about multiphonics. In the case of brass, there are basically two ways to perform multiphonics. One of them that's very common and not difficult is using voice and buzzing at the same time. And I've included, let's see, well, the Robert Erickson general speech is a really good example of that kind of thing, and a lot of other techniques. Really interesting theatrical piece written for my teacher, Stuart Dempster. It's a really interesting trombone piece that involves both speech and conventional playing sort of simultaneously. The Dlugochevsky Space is a Diamond. I can't find a score to it. Fascinating piece for trumpet. I believe this recording is Gerard Schwartz, who was a trumpet virtuoso before he became a conductor. And this, it kind of has everything that I can imagine a trumpet could do, including pedal tones, of course, which pedal tones on brass instruments are quite idiomatic. Existed before the 20th century, I would think, even in classical music. And then I've included a really neat video excerpt. If we're talking about brass extended techniques, I think the composer that I first think of is Duke Ellington, who, relied on his trumpet players and trombonists to do all kinds of different techniques, timbres and slides and growls and, flutter tongue and different mutes. His players would have multiple mutes, including hats, maybe even different kinds of hats that did different things. this excerpt is a famous trumpet solo from Black and Tan Fantasy, and this is from a film from 1929 in which Ellington is rehearsing with his trumpet player, and you'll hear all kinds of use of half valving and voice and buzzing at the same time, and then the use of the harmon mute, which without the stem in it is a with the stem in it, is often called a wah-wah mute, and you'll see why, because it enables you to do wah-wah effects without a plunger, and it's a different sound from a plunger. Anyway, so we could talk all about mutes and plungers, and this ability of trombonists and trumpet players to sort of create vowels by, again, changing the shape of the outside of the bell of the horn. So that's an important part of this music. So check those out. And again, lots of free improvisation and jazz, just conventional jazz. These types of extended techniques are part of the literature, part of what happens, more so in jazz than in classical music, I would think. Let's move on to woodwinds. And this is where we're going to get a lot of our techniques, extended techniques, we're going to find in free improvisation. And I included the first recorded instance of a multiphonic, which in woodwind instruments, multiphonics can be produced by including voice, but also by using unusual fingerings and different usages of the embouchure to make more than one pitch happen. I don't fully understand the physics of multiphonics. One of the things that happens is that one is isolating overtones, partials that are already in the sound and bringing them out. But I think also multiphonics involve dividing the resonator of a woodwind instrument into multiple parts. I'm not sure how that works with the reed. But this John Coltrane harmonique it's a 12-bar blues tune that features two different multiphonics. Now, Coltrane in an interview said that Thelonious Monk taught him how to do multiphonics, which I have no other reference except for this interview, and why Monk would know how to do multiphonics on a saxophone, I don't know. But Coltrane asserted that. And then I've given you some much more extreme instances of multiphonics on saxophones. And John Butcher, a saxophonist who was at BYU a few years ago, visited. He does some really gorgeous multiphonics in this little video excerpt. And by the way, as we're going, it might be wise to pause this video and then go listen to these excerpts. And for the most part, you don't have to listen to the whole thing. Try to get a sampling. Try to listen to enough to get an idea. And hopefully you'll be turned on by these and you'll want to listen to more of it. Okay, so John Butcher, very interesting English, mostly tenor saxophonist. And he does all kinds of other effects using different kinds of air sound and different kinds of tongue slaps, extreme tonguing, and of course circular breathing, microtonal inflections. So, again, multiphonics on saxophone involve unusual fingerings. Some of the fingerings don't work for every saxophone. You can find fingering charts for multiphonics on the web, of course. And some of them work for some people and some don't. And so people usually develop their own multiphonics. This is why you find these particular effects more in improvisation than in written music, because it's much easier and more efficient to experiment with these and use them in actual praxis than to write them on paper and hope that your player can figure them out or learn them, or that they're actually possible on his or her instrument body, combination. Then I've included an excerpt of the well-known, highly influential soprano saxophonist Evan Parker, who specializes in doing, I would say it's like polyphonic solos on the soprano saxophone. So he's developed multiphonics to such an extent that he's not only playing sort of chords on the saxophone, he's actually playing counterpoint between different layers of the horn. And of course with circular breathing, extreme circular breathing. So if you want more of Evan Parker, there's an album called Conic Sections in which Parker, well, each cut of this record, CD, whatever, he doesn't breathe throughout an entire 7-minute track. So he's circular breathing the whole time. Then I've included one classical example, the Sequenza number 12 for bassoon by Luciano Berio. These sequenzas are a series of solo compositions by Berio for various instruments, and one for voice that we'll look at in a moment. The bassoon one is really kind of fun and has lots of fun sort of extended techniques. Berio is interesting because he had a complex relationship with the idea of extended techniques, and he sort of had he was a little cranky about it, even though he used them in his music to a certain extent. So this is, the lone classical example of woodwind extended techniques. Okay, now let's talk about voice. This is where we get into a lot of material. Now, of course, the voice, how do we talk about extended techniques with the voice? Pretty much any sound that the voice or the mouth can make is going to exist in some language in the world. And so the question is, importing mouth or vocal sounds from outside of the classical vocal tradition. Maybe that's one way to look at it. But certainly, and borrowing, anyway, that's what I meant. But again, saying, okay, we get how to sing beautifully bel canto in this method. What about making music with other sounds, whether borrowed or invented, including speech? We could include speech in the category of extended vocal techniques, maybe. We could include Sprechstimme, which was sort of invented by Arnold Schoenberg. Certainly in my music going back to the early 80s, sort of borrowing rap as a method. This is in the really old school of rap that I was beguiled by this method. It hasn't caught on as much in classical music as one might imagine. And, using different things to alter the voice. We don't have time to talk about electronic intervention or filtering of live sounds. That's a whole separate question. But anyway, again, I mentioned Luciano Berio, the Sequenza for voice I've included, and it's really cool, this video, because it's a fun video of the performer performing this piece, and then there are little bits of the score projected onto the video, so you can see how these different effects are created. Then I've included a really influential piece by Ligeti, Hungarian composer that we'll talk about a lot. Very influential, important composer from the later 20th century. Aventure for voices and instruments. And this piece has a lot of vocal sounds. Just, again, not a lot that any of us couldn't easily create, but ones that aren't usually used in the context of classical music. Then I've included some kind of interesting videos, some of which you may be familiar with. One kind of singing that's been interesting to me for many years is throat singing, or harmonic singing, which often involves the singing of more than one pitch at a time. And again, this is probably mostly the isolation of a higher partial in addition to the fundamental. So really featuring one of the partials. And I've included this Anna Maria Hefele, who is, I believe, a German woman who's sort of specialized. I think she's coming out of the classical music milieu and has really developed this technique of isolating overtones, and she can do a lot with that technique. So I've included that in this demonstration. And then I've included 3 videos that involve traditional throat singing from different cultures. And again, throat singing it's not universal, but it occurs in a lot of different cultures. We're mostly familiar with throat singing from the steppes of Asia, from Mongolia, different parts of Mongolia. But also, of course, there's a very well-known tradition in Tibetan Buddhism, but also in South Africa, in the Arctic, Inuit throat singing, which is quite interesting, quite different. This is a very old tradition involving duets of female singers, kind of a quasi, it seems to be a sort of competitive or fun game-like experience. The unique thing about Inuit female singing is that it involves inhale singing quite a bit, which is definitely kind of an extended technique. Again, something that a lot of us did when we were very little, and then we stopped doing because we annoyed our parents or whoever. I haven't seen a lot of inhale singing in classical music. I think teachers mostly say that it's going to damage people's voices. Okay, so there's tons there. I mean, the voice is kind of like the ultimate instrument, and so anyway, considering that, it's one interesting thing to think about when we're talking about voice is that in a lot of orchestral instruments, we have sort of like one timbre for each instrument, or one sort of range of timbre that's considered the right, or the attractive, beautiful timbre associated with that instrument. I mean, some of them have more than one, but in the voice, if we view vowels as timbres, well, here's an instrument that modulates timbre, the voice, with incredible complexity and speed and variety. And once we include consonants, which are like percussion sounds, noises, we really have a remarkable instrument that really no, extra human instrument can really match in terms of complexity and efficiency, I would say. Okay, let's talk about piano. This is the instrument that I think composers got most excited about extended techniques for in the 20th century and 21st century. Sadly, there's a lot of meanies who don't like us to do extended techniques on pianos, which, pianos tend to be institutionally owned, and they're part of the sort of capital sort of possessions of institutions, and so there's a great impetus to prevent damage to these instruments. But let's talk about piano. There are two main categories of extended techniques on the piano. One of them, inside piano. So this is manipulation, direct manipulation of the strings mainly, also other parts of the inside of the piano, mostly by the hands, but also by other objects. Mallets, picks, etc. We could talk a lot about these techniques. This is another area where I've had particular interest. Okay, so that's inside piano. The person who kind of innovated, at least in classical music, who we think of as the father of inside piano would be Henry Cowell. Very important American composer, influential, sort of the father of experimental music in the United States. He wrote many pieces that involve manipulating the strings. We've already looked at Cowell in reference to tone clusters, and I think Charles Ives probably was the first composer to write down clusters, but Cowell really developed clusters. But then we have pieces in which he requests that the performer pluck strings, etc. I've included two pieces of his. One of them, the Banshee, famous piece in which the performer rubs the strings in a lengthwise, sort of bows them with the hands lengthwise to create a very eerie kind of ghostly sound. But, lurking in these sounds is a melody, a sort of modal melody. The video here it's kind of cool. It's a little bit corny. It's very sort of goth, The person who's performing has really long nails and kind of wispy black clothing on, which seems kind of appropriate. And then another video, which you should watch both, I would say. Another video which has the score. Then the other piece is called Aeolian Harp, and this is a fun piece that involves turning the piano basically into an auto harp. If you understand how the auto harp works, this is an instrument that has a lot of strings on it, and you press buttons to dampen strings that aren't included in a particular chord. And that's what he instructs the player, and this is not easy to do, to press down keys without pressing hard enough for the hammers to hit the strings. So in other words, just to raise the dampers on those particular strings, and then to strum the strings. And it enables him to create this strummed chord effect, which is quite pretty. So I've included, again, videos with both the score and a live person performing them. Then a later composer that I've already mentioned, great pioneer in inside piano technique, George Crumb, the Macrocosmos, I think from 1970, very influential piece that kind of has every possible, technique you could imagine, with the performer manipulating the inside of the piano directly with the hands, and using, for instance, drinking glasses to create a slide effect similar to, a slide guitar, which is a fun thing to do, using a thimble to do different things on the strings. Anyway, lots of effects there. Okay, so we've got inside piano is the one category. The second category is prepared piano. I already talked about prepared viola. Prepared piano, much more common instrument to prepare. John Cage definitely invented the prepared piano as we understand it. His first piece was this Bacchanal, and which he composed in, I believe, 1938 when he was at Cornish College of the Arts, a place that I taught at. I actually followed him around. I went to school at Mills College, and I had his job accompanying modern dance classes, which he had maybe, 60 years earlier, I don't know. And then I went to Cornish College of the Arts in Seattle, where he also was a pianist and composer for the dance department. Anyway, he was asked to write a piece for a dance, and at that time he was focusing strictly on percussion music. That's a whole nother story. He had kind of rejected orchestral instruments, or at least orchestral instrument players, because he thought their sort of professionalism didn't allow them to be open to experimentation, or at least to playing new music. And I don't have time to talk about that. But he thought, well, what am I going to do when this choreographer requested him to write music for her choreography? Because, I only compose for percussion, and this theater it was to be in didn't have a pit for all these giant percussion instruments, and it had a piano. So he decided, well, can I turn the piano into percussion orchestra? And then he started experimenting with, well, how can I do this? Maybe I can alter the strings themselves. Okay, again, we're looking at the vibrating medium, leaving the actuator, which is the hammers, as they are, leaving the resonator as it is, and altering the vibrating medium. And this, through experimentation, he discovered that he could put objects between the strings of the piano and radically alter the sound of these notes. And then you have this wonderful keyboard that's a very efficient mechanical device to actuate these newly found percussion sounds. And so he started experimenting with screws and bolts, screws with washers between the heads and the string, different places along the length of the string, putting more than one object between the same two strings, also using rubber, wood, plastic, etc. And his scores, he wrote a bunch of pieces over the course of, he wrote this one first piece, again, Bacchanal, in the late 30s. Then he stopped. He didn't write another piece for prepared piano until he had moved to New York, and then he just didn't have room to keep percussion instruments, and most of his music for a few years there in the 40s was for prepared piano, almost all written for dance pieces. He was sort of getting work as a dance accompanist and composer, and he was collaborating with Merce Cunningham, famous choreographer and dancer, and they worked together for decades. And so now the unique thing, each of these pieces for prepared piano has very specific instructions for preparations. So Cage would say, okay, he would have a table of preparations. He would say, you need to put this size of screw, this position, this many inches from the dampers on this string, etc. Each string that was used in a piece had a different, very specific kind of preparation. There's a lot we could talk about in that. Again, this is an area of particular interest to me. And so how do these preparations work? Well, nobody's fully described it. I think that some things that happen is, especially with metal objects, which in some ways are the most effective ones, several things happen. If you're inserting a screw between two strings, first, you're stopping that string. You're changing the length of the vibrating part of the string. However, if it's metal, you're actually creating vibrating portions of the string on both sides of that screw, but also the screw itself may be very resonant, and because it has its own size and its own density, it'll have its own sort of pitch. Those combine, and if you put the screw on a node where there's a harmonic that it sort of actuates your, anyway, it's a very complex interaction, and of course resulting interference between different frequencies. So it's a really fruitful, fascinating sound world. So I've included both Bacchanal. This is the earliest of Cage's prepared piano pieces, and in some ways the simplest. And then he gets very complex. His well-known piece for prepared piano, the Sonatas and Interludes, which was not written for a dance. It's actually an extended sort of virtuoso piece for prepared piano that has very complex preparations and also uses unprepared notes, which was unusual. I would encourage you to look at other pieces for prepared piano by Cage, but again, I've included this Sonatas and Interlude, Sonata number 2, with a view of the inside of piano. You know what? I'm going to add a couple of other things that you can look at in terms of Cage prepared piano music. Then I've included, for myself, I've done some work on piano, lots of inside and prepared piano, but one thing I've included is my piano blog, which is a kind of a collection of improvisations using inside and prepared piano. I've used my own piano, so I don't have to deal with people getting cranky about me preparing piano. I've used a lot of different kinds of things. In this set of pieces, I've used shells, I've used different kinds of wooden objects, I've used slides, I've used, like chopsticks and plucked the chopsticks so that they go back and forth, things like that. So I've included that. That's in the piano blog on SoundCloud. And then I've included one video of a type of improvisation I've done for the last couple of years using electric motors to actuate the strings of the piano. You get fascinating sounds that don't resemble really much of anything else. So I've included that video where you kind of see me standing around a piano. It doesn't look like I'm doing much, but that's a type of music where recordings don't quite capture the complexity of the sound. Anyway, so yeah, that's a little survey of extended techniques. There's so much we could talk about, but of course this is kind of a survey course. So enjoy. I hope I've asked you to try some different things out on your own instrument or voice for the worksheet, and I hope you have fun with that, and maybe you'll get to use these sounds in the future. Okay, we'll talk to you soon. Bye.